Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. It may be apt when it comes to carbon pricing that today it's old coals being raked over after Kevin Rudd's admission that his decision to dump the emissions trading policy before the last election was a big mistake. But is he being indulgent and revisionist, as some in his party have suggested, or is he trying to pin some of the blame to Julia Gillard? Also, the government has opened an offshore detention centre, but it's offshore in Tasmania. To discuss these issues, we've been joined by Liberal Senator Mathias Cormann and Labor MP Rob Mitchell. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. Good to be here.
Rob, is it time for Julia Gillard to say exactly what her stance was when the discussions were being held on the decision to dump or delay the emissions trading scheme before the last election?
Look, I think that what we've said all along from 2007 and the 2010 election, we support putting a price on carbon. We've made that very clear. We went to the election with it and we're going ahead and doing it. Now, we can sit there and dwell on the past, but the past is the past. What we've got to do is look at making sure that we're making decisions that are in the national interest, that are going to be better for cleaner, greener economies, and also to cut our emissions pollution that we are getting out.
But given that Julia Gillard's credibility has been questioned because she went back on an election promise over the carbon tax, couldn't her credibility on this also be under question because we don't know whether she gave advice to the then Prime Minister to delay the emissions trading scheme or to dump it completely forever?
Well, look, I think that we need to clear up one thing, and that was before the election, Julia Gillard said quite clear in her interviews that she would put a price on carbon if we're elected. And we've done that. We've gone through and we're putting that program in place. I know people want to say, oh, it's a carbon tax, but the fact of the matter is she did say that she would be seeking to have a carbon pollution reduction scheme in place. Now, what happened in 2007 or 8 or 9, I have no idea. I was not there. I'm not privy to cabinet meetings, so it's, I can't answer that. But what I can say is that we are doing what we said we'd do, and that is get a price on our carbon pollution.
Matthias, is it the case that Julia Gillard, before the last election and since the last election, has been advocating a price on carbon, that hasn't changed?
Nobody knows what Julia Gillard stands for when it comes to this. Before the election, she told Kevin Rudd to dump the ETS. She was emphatic in her promise to the Australian people that there would be no carbon tax under the government she leads. And of course, after the election, after a meeting with her Green Alliance partner, she decides there is going to be a carbon tax. If she thought the carbon tax was such a good idea, why didn't she tell people before the election that that is the way she would go? And why didn't she take it to caucus before announcing it with the Greens and others? We now know the reason why, because there's clearly a sizable group of people within the Labor caucus and within the Labor cabinet, senior ministers in the Labor cabinet, that share our concerns about a carbon tax.
Rob Mitchell, are there people in the caucus, in the cabinet, that, as Matthias says, share the coalition's concerns about the carbon tax?
Look, the first thing we should say is Matthias is just making up history as he goes along. I'm sure that Matthias reads The Australian, and I'm sure that on the 20th of August, when Dennis Shanahan did his article on the Prime Minister outlaying her future if she was elected,
I rule out a carbon tax is what she said on the 20th of August.
Let's go through the whole quote. The whole quote says that I do not rule out a carbon pollution reduction scheme, an emissions trading scheme, if you like. What I will rule out is a carbon tax, like a GST on your dockets. No. What we've got is a flat rate for 3 years while we move to a transition into an emissions trading scheme. Now, let's be clear too, that if we just went out and did this straight away and there were problems, you guys would be up there doing your usual three-word slogan, attack it, it's the government can't deliver. What we're doing is a measured approach to get this through, to make sure that we do the right thing by the national interest. And that's what we're doing. So we're delivering in exactly what we said. We don't rule out a carbon pollution reduction scheme.
Can you say that with a straight face?
Oh, I can say it. I'm sure if you read the article again, you'll be happily coming back saying, look, I do apologise, Rob.
There will be no carbon tax under the government.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what she said.
And
there is no carbon tax. This is a carbon pollution reduction scheme. A flat tax. I mean, look, let's be honest. Everything we say you called a big new tax. You had a big new tax when you had the milk tax, the sugar tax, but you didn't call them taxes. You called them a levy. Now, when we do it, you say it's a tax. So you really got to be clear. You're jumping all over the place here. The
Your own
reality is,
people are referring to it as a carbon tax,
in
my friend.
2007, the reality is in 2010 we went to the election with a carbon, putting a price on carbon. What has changed is you lot changed. You lot changed from supporting it, supporting an emissions trading scheme, which we tried to get through after 2007. You rejected it twice in the Senate. You said you supported it, then you said you didn't. Then Tony Abbott says it's complete crap. Now he says, oh, it does. The man does have an effect on carbon pollution. The only people that are all over the shop are you guys.
Lyndal, if I can just say something here, we are opposed to putting a price on carbon because in the absence of an appropriately comprehensive global agreement, all it will do, it'll push up the cost of everything, it will make Australia less competitive, it'll cost jobs, it'll put pressure on our economy without doing anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. To ask people to make a sacrifice without it actually making a difference is just completely inappropriate.
But Mathias, isn't that exactly what you're doing, although a different mechanism, that your direct action scheme to be funded by the taxpayer is aiming to achieve the same target? If you say that target wouldn't make a difference on emissions, why are you going ahead spending the money?
And the important point is that our direct action plan reduces emissions in Australia in a way that reduces emissions in the world. Our direct action plan doesn't shift emissions from Australia to other parts of the world. Putting a tax on carbon will make Australian businesses less competitive. Being more efficient, in terms of being more energy efficient or being better with our soil management or planting trees or going for better technologies to reduce emissions in Australia, that doesn't shift emissions into other parts of the world. However, what Julia Gillard is proposing to do is put a price on carbon that will make Australian businesses less competitive than polluters overseas. So the jobs, the emissions will all go overseas, so there will be no reduction in emissions globally. Yet people in Australia have been asked to make a sacrifice for no purpose whatsoever.
Rob Mitchell, the Prime Minister also said today that the household compensation will be announced with the carbon price details in the middle of the year. Is that too long a wait, given you have this argument in a vacuum in the absence of those details now?
They don't want to put it in the budget, that's
the only thing that's in the vacuum is the opposition's policies. I think that we do need to take our time.
Mathias, if we can let Rob speak.
You want to talk about rhetoric and your three-word slogans. That's rhetoric. What we're doing is that we're going through this methodically. We are going to make sure that we get it right. This is about the national interest. It's not about Tony Abbott's political interest. And that's why we've got to go through this slowly, step by step, make sure that we get things right so that when it comes into place, we'll be able to see the economy move on to a cleaner, greener energy, a cleaner, greener economy, and all the henny-penny stuff that the opposition are talking about will be just washed away.
Mathias, one of the Western Australian Nationals upper house members in your home state has questioned Tony Abbott's direct action policy, saying it itself would amount to a big new tax and that it's picking winners. And Philip Gardner said, how often a government successful in picking winners? He says, be honest, Tony, you're funding this with a great big tax. If you can't convince all the WA Nationals, how are you going to convince the rest of the country?
Well, I mean, the Federal National Party is, of course, totally opposed to the Labor Party carbon tax, and they're totally behind Tony Abbott's direct action plan. Tony Crook, as a WA National, is not part of the federal coalition. He sits in the Parliament as an independent, and of course, he has to make his own decisions, as do his colleagues over in Western Australia. I just say to my colleagues in the National Party back in Western Australia, they should be very conscious about asking people to make a sacrifice, to pay more for everything, to put jobs at risk for no environmental gain, because the carbon tax that the Prime Minister is putting forward will not do anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, but it will push up the price of everything.
Rob, is there potential, given the WA Nationals haven't decided on their position on carbon pricing, to try and win over Tony Crook as a vote on the floor of Parliament?
Look, Tony Crook is an intelligent man, and he'll look through that very methodically, I know that. What it does show is there are divisions within the coalition. Now, you've got
He's
the
not part of the coalition. He's not part of the coalition.
Well, last time I looked, the WA Nationals were part of the coalition with the WA Liberal government. Or has that changed again?
They're actually not in a coalition, so you should check your facts.
So you've got the Nationals and the Liberals split again. on what they're doing, and we know that this happened even when the change of leadership. With Malcolm Turnbull, we had a Liberal Party having a handshake agreement, trust them on their word, then they changed their mind again.
Did you listen to Kevin
Rudd
last night?
I think what's happening is that the Nationals are methodically going through it. They're going to look at it. They know that what we're proposing is a better way. It lets market sort out the way to go, not Tony Abbott's silly little plan of using taxpayer money to reward big polluters and plant a few trees, and he reckons that's going to solve the world's emissions problems. I mean, no one can take that serious.
If we could move on, gentlemen. Mathias Cormann, the government's announced it will open a new temporary detention centre in southern Tasmania to take up to 400 single men to take some of the pressure off Christmas Island, while 2 other detention centres, one in Darwin and one in Western Australia, are being built. Is that a sensible measure given the protests, the riots we've seen on Christmas Island?
Look, I mean, the whole border protection policies of this government are a complete mess now. This government is in chaos. They're losing control. This is one of the many broken promises of this Prime Minister. We've got to remember that before the election, she promised us that there would be a new offshore processing centre, in East Timor rather than Nauru. We thought it should have been in Nauru, where the government actually was keen to work with us. But here we are. Since the election, one new detention centre after the other. And the reason that is because she has lost complete control. We can pinpoint the start of these problems to the Labor government's decision back in August 2008 to weaken the very strong border protection policy framework that was put in place by the Howard government. We created a solution. Labor took that solution and created a problem.
Rob Mitchell, even Andrew Wilkie, the independent MP in Tasmania, doesn't like the idea of a detention centre opening there. He's opposed to them. Even he says that the policy is a mess. Doesn't the continuing opening of new detention centres show that the government's just running to keep up with the problem?
No, what it shows is that we've got an issue with refugees right across the world, and it is happening, and it's a growing problem. What we've said and what we're doing is looking at this as a temporary solution because of the infrastructure issues up at Christmas Island from the recent events there. Now, Andrew Wilkie, I know, is opposed to having people in detention centres full stop. So by having that opinion, of course, that if you open a new centre or you put more people in a centre, he's not going to be happy about it. I understand that, I appreciate where he's coming from, but we've got a job to do, and we've got to make sure that we do it in the national interest. And because we've got problems at Christmas Island with infrastructure at the moment, we're looking at a temporary position.
Mathias, you want to say something?
Well, I mean, these are obviously all problems of the government's own making. There was no need to have these problems. The issue was actually resolved. And so what Labor is doing now is neither fair nor compassionate. They've put the people smugglers back in charge of our immigration policy. It was exactly the wrong way to go. We told them so at the time. And here, what is happening now is just dealing with the outcomes of a failed policy that was implemented by the Labor Party.
Well, gentlemen, Mathias Cormann and Rob Mitchell, that's where we'll have to leave it. Thank you very much for your time today. And thank you too for joining us on Capitol Hill. Join us at the same time tomorrow.
For the big